Sometimes you've got a word to say and you just can't wait to say it. So, no offense, Dusty, I wasn't trying to skip you. Well, we're continuing through John's Gospel, and in our journey through his Gospel, today we've come to, I would say, probably two of the more well-known miracles in not just John's Gospel, but the miracles of Jesus, two of the more well-known ones. We'll look at the feeding of the 5,000, and we will look at Jesus walking on water. Now, the feeding of the 5,000 is, it's actually the only miracle of Jesus apart from the resurrection that is recorded in all four Gospels. So I think that plays into its familiarity to us. And then you think about Jesus walking on water, and that is a miracle which is just so simple to grasp in its essence, right? And yet incredibly mind-blowing when we think about it. And so I think because of that, these are well-known miracles. They're probably very familiar to us. And their familiarity might cause us to not look at them quite as deeply, or maybe not look at it with quite as fresh of eyes or hear it with fresh ears, that kind of thing. And I want us to fight against that today. I want us to hear the words of the text that John shares with us as clearly as we can. And I think one of the ways that will help us in that is by looking at these two miracles together. I would say they go together in part because they happened in the same 24-hour period. So that's part of the reason. But they also go together because in conjunction with one another, they present some radically different responses to the person of Jesus. I think we are meant to see the misguided responses in the feeding of the 5,000 and compare them to the faith-filled response of the disciples as Jesus walks on the water. So I think we'll have good benefit from looking at them together today. So with that rubric in place, I want us to just ponder a question real quick before we dive into the text. And the question is this: if someone asked you, who is Jesus? And they genuinely did not know, had not heard his name before. If you were having a conversation and you mentioned Jesus and they just responded, well, who's Jesus? How would you describe him to that person? How would you describe him? Would your answer, would my answer focus primarily on his miracles? Would it focus upon the teachings of Jesus? Would it focus on a relationship with Jesus? Would it focus on the love of Jesus, the divinity of Jesus, the humanity of Jesus? What would we focus on in our response to that question? And I would venture a guess to say that our answer would probably have some kind of combination of those things and other things that I didn't just list. And I think that's how it should be. I think we should have kind of a multifaceted answer there instead of just focusing on a single aspect of Jesus' identity. Because if we were to do that, I would say we are likely to misrepresent him and even make him out to be someone that he's not. Right? And this would be true with any person, right? I mean, anybody that we try to describe by focusing on only one aspect of who they are, we would be flattening them into a very shallow version of themselves. And so how much more would that be true with describing the Son of God become human, right? If we only focused on one specific thing. Man, and so I think what we can be reminded of about John's gospel and his goal in writing his gospel is that the signs of Jesus are meant to reveal to us his identity so that we might believe who Jesus is. Not believe a very narrow description of who he is, or not even believe who we want him to be, but believe in Jesus as he is. And so when we think about that, we're going to get to another of his signs. This will be the fourth sign that Jesus, public sign that he performs. As we do that in the first scene today, we're going to notice two responses toward Jesus that are both misguided for different reasons. And so I would encourage you to follow with me as I read. We're in John chapter 6, and I'll start in verse 1, page 891 in the Pew Bibles, if you'd like to follow there. And so we're going to look first at the feeding of the 5,000. So John 6, verse 1 says, "After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, 'Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?' He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, 'There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many?'" We're just going to pause right there for now. So as John has typically done so far throughout his gospel, he begins a story by giving us the background and the setting details of everything. So Jesus is near the Sea of Galilee. He's probably on the northeastern side near Bethsaida. There's a large crowd that's coming to him, again, prompted by the signs that Jesus had been performing, the healings that he'd been doing on the sick, especially John mentions. They're on this mountain, so I think we can safely assume that resources are a bit more scarce than they would be, like in an actual town. And then John also tells us it's close to Passover time. Passover, the feast of Passover is near. So Jesus is in an area with heavy Jewish influence. He's there during a time when people would have been focused upon and been reliving the story of the Exodus, complete with those themes of freedom and miraculous provision. We think about how God parted the Red Sea and he provided bread from heaven and water from the rock. And what drew near to Jesus was a large crowd that was getting hungry and probably had high expectations due to things they had heard about Jesus, the signs that he had been performing. Maybe some of them saw the miracles that he was performing. So all that to say, no one is coming into this scene with a blank slate. I mean, everyone there would have had his or her own ideas, expectations, hopes about who this Jesus might be. But while Jesus sees the crowd approaching, the first thing that he does, the first part of the story, focuses on the disciples, and specifically on the responses of 2 of the disciples. So Jesus first turned to Philip and asked him where they ought to buy bread for the people to eat. Now we know from back in John chapter 1 that Philip is from Bethsaida. And it's where this scene most likely takes place. So it's kind of his home turf that they're on. Makes sense that Jesus would ask Philip, well, where should we get food for everybody? I mean, Philip probably knows the best places to buy food. He knows which merchants in the market would have the best bread. Don't go to that one because maybe that one's overpriced. I mean, he knows. He knows this is his spot. Makes perfect sense to ask Philip what should be done. But what we see in verse 6 is that wasn't the only reason that Jesus asked Philip. Jesus was also testing him. Now, he knew that he was going to miraculously multiply a young boy's lunch to feed the crowd. Jesus already knew what he was going to do. He knew where the food was going to come from. And I would add to that, he already knew what was in Philip's heart and mind. That's not a mystery to Jesus. He's not testing Philip to learn something new about him. He's testing Philip so that Philip can learn something new. Learn something new about himself, probably, but learn something new about Jesus as well. And I think there's a really interesting, and I would say significant link here back to the time of the Exodus. So after the very first Passover, after God had brought his people out of slavery, after he had parted the Red Sea, led them through, the people became hungry and thirsty as they were journeying to Mount Sinai. And listen to God's response to their thirst and their hunger. This is out of Exodus chapter 15. In Exodus 15:24, it says, "The people grumbled against Moses, saying, 'What shall we drink?' And he cried to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a log, and he threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. There the Lord made for them a statute and a rule, and there he tested them." And then if we skip down just a little bit into chapter 16, verse 2, "The whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the people of Israel said to them, 'Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you've brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger.' Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Behold, I am about to rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not.'" Now again, God didn't need to test the people then in the Exodus to find out the nature of their faith in him. He knew them. He knew all people. He knew what was in their hearts. The test revealed to the people themselves the nature of their faith in God. Their thirst, their hunger showed that they were quick to grumble against God. They were quick to doubt his ability to provide for them. Even though God had already shown his great power through the 10 plagues and the parting of the waters and the defeat of Pharaoh's army, the people still showed a real lack of faith in God when it came to their thirst and their hunger specifically. And so you fast forward to another Passover season in John chapter 6, and things really haven't changed a whole lot. Jesus has already revealed his power, not just to the crowds, but to his disciples as well. He's turned water into wine. He's healed the official's son. He has healed the invalid at the pool. And those are just the ones that John has listed for us so far. But even in the midst of such things, Philip, he still shows a lack of faith in Jesus' ability to provide for those who are in need. And he immediately does mental calculations trying to figure out the cost of purchasing food for that entire crowd. It's as if he thinks the only possible solution to their hunger has to be found in the local markets. He doesn't see any other option for meeting needs. And then Andrew speaks up. I would say his faith is only marginally deeper, if that, right? So he finds a boy with a single lunch, but he still doubts the sufficiency of what is present. He can't see anything more than what is just right in front of his eyes at that very moment. Both Philip and Andrew have misguided responses toward Jesus. They recognize Jesus' love and compassion, right? They don't question for a moment that Jesus desires to meet the needs, desires to feed that crowd that's present there. But they seriously underestimate and they doubt Jesus' power to provide during a time of need. The question then is, what about you? What about me? Do we, like Philip, like Andrew, do we underestimate? Do we doubt Jesus' power to provide in times of need in our own lives? I was thinking of a story from back when Megan and I lived in Vincennes, there was a little old lady who attended our church named June. And when I say little old lady, I mean, Megan can vouch, she was not an inch over 5 foot, probably 4'9", 4'10", spunky as all get out, though. I mean, so I would visit June at different times, and some of those times she would take me out for lunch, and there was times where I'd meet at her house and she'd drive us. June drove one of those huge Lincoln Continentals from the 1970s. I mean, it was rather humorous that the smallest lady was driving probably the biggest sedan in town, right? And her her driving was a little sketchy at times, but I felt safe enough because if we ever got in an accident, I mean, the other person was taking the worst of it because this thing was just huge, this car that she drove. But I bring up her car because the point of my story is that June had been a widow for quite a number of years by the time that Megan and I moved to Vincennes and we met her. She didn't have a lot of wealth. Her income was pretty meager. And because of that, she told me one day that she regularly prayed for her car, prayed that it wouldn't have mechanical issues. And not only that, she told me that she prayed specifically for her tires, that they wouldn't go bad, that they wouldn't even need to be replaced due to just normal wear. Now, when she told me that, I kind of looked the next time I was around her car. The tires were pretty old already. But she prayed for those tires, and she was fully convinced that Jesus could provide for her in that way by making those tires last, not go bad. And I'm convinced that she was right in that. June passed away about a year before we moved here to Eureka. And she never did replace those tires. She didn't. I mean, the Jesus that June knew was fully able to make her tires last far longer than they should have. And so she prayed for that, and she trusted Jesus with that. And I'm convinced he provided for her in that. I would love to know what just ever ended up. That was 12, 13 years ago now, like whatever ended up happening to that car, right? But Jesus provided for June. During adult Sunday school class this morning, we got to share stories with one another about God's provision, how he's led and provided in our lives. It's just always so wonderful to hear those stories and praise God in response to them. And really the question is, it says in verse 5, Jesus lifted up his eyes and saw the crowd. When we lift up our eyes and we see what lies before us, do we believe that Jesus is able to meet those needs? Or do we mirror Philip and Andrew, underestimating or even doubting Jesus' ability to provide? It's a good challenge for us, I think, this morning. Well, the first 9 verses of John 6 focus on the misguided responses of those two disciples in the face of Jesus' upcoming miracle. The next 6 verses focus on the misguided response of the crowd following the miracle that Jesus performed. So let's pick it back up in verse 10. Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, "Gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. Scholars speculate why there were 12 baskets of leftover food, right? I mean, Jesus, if you're performing this miracle, why not just make it exact, right? I mean, obviously we're starting with what is not near enough, so why not Why not make it exact so that when they get to the end, it's like, wow, we had exactly what we needed. Here's one reason I would propose. Philip and Andrew were the ones focused on in the first 9 verses. I think all 12 disciples probably doubted, probably underestimated Jesus' ability to provide in that setting. So I think the 12 baskets of leftovers provided the opportunity for each disciple to reflect on their own lack of faith as they carried that full basket down the mountain. Remember, they're on a mountain and they're going to go down to the Sea of Galilee. So just kind of wonder on that journey, if I'm carrying this big basket of food down a mountain, I'm thinking, maybe I should have thought a little differently about what Jesus has the ability to do. That's just my thought. It's not even super relevant to what we're going to talk about, but anyway, 12 baskets left over. Verse 14. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world." Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. So again, we got to remember the details surrounding this miracle. It took place during the Passover season. It was at hand. We might equate the atmosphere of the Passover season with something a little bit like 4th of July in our context. Right? I mean, the Passover celebrations took place, and they focused on God providing freedom from oppressors. And not just remembering past freedom, but looking for current freedom as well. Remember, this is a context where Rome is ruling the world in this area especially right now. So you think about, okay, it's this season when freedom is in the air, right? And the crowd was quite large. We're told 5,000 men. That's not a bad start to a potential rebellion, if you think about it. An army of 5,000, that's pretty good. And in addition, Jesus just showed that he could produce food and presumably other supplies out of thin air. I mean, think about that. I recently read a book about Ulysses S. Grant. He was a famous Civil War general, later became president. One thing about Grant as a war general, he was quite adept in managing the details of war, and specifically overseeing supplies. That's such a crucial component to war that a civilian like me doesn't normally think about, right? Grant's supply trains were masterfully organized. And along with that, he had a knack for knowing when an army could break free from their supply chain and just kind of live off the land and have an advantage in terms of movement. The reality was that no general wanted to put their army in a position where they lacked necessary supplies. Well, what this miracle from Jesus just showed was that you could take these 5,000 men and turn them into an army, and you wouldn't ever have to be concerned about that. I mean, imagine the possibilities for an army of 5,000 that could go anywhere at any time and always have everything that they need, because Jesus has shown that he can provide that. So we see, the fact that they want to come make him king kind of makes sense in that. But Jesus knew what they were thinking, and so he withdrew from them because what they were thinking was not in line with the Father's purposes. It wasn't in line with Jesus' ministry. The crowd had a different misguided response to Jesus than his disciples did earlier. They wanted Jesus to be the person that they wanted him to be, right? To be a deliverer and to be the king that they wanted him to be at that time in a specific way. I would say it is entirely possible to read John's gospel, to read all of John's gospel, or any of the gospels, or I would say it's impossible to read the entire Bible and still have a misguided response to Jesus. I mean, imagine the possibilities if, because of Jesus, oh, I never have to face persecution. Or because of Jesus, we never have to deal with any physical ailments, or we never have to go hungry for even a single day, or we never have to experience a drought, or we never have to clean up after a natural disaster. I mean, when we allow our expectations to go there, we can attempt to turn Jesus into the person that we want him to be. And don't get me wrong, the time for those things is coming. The time when Jesus will reign from his throne on the earth is coming. We are given certainty of that. But to use a phrase from John's gospel, that hour has not come yet. It's not here yet. It's not yet come in its fullness. And when we seek to force it along according to our own timing or desires, really we're displaying the same misguided response that the crowds displayed when they wanted to go make Jesus be king here and now. Now again, this does not mean that we can't ask Jesus for provision or for protection or for healing. It just means that we shouldn't force him into those things. Not that we could anyway, but to think that we could. What we ought to do instead is to receive Jesus as he is. Really, what we ought to do is respond as the disciples did in the next scene. I think this is why it's so good to look at these two stories together. So look with me now at verse 16 as we transition to this second scene of Jesus walking on the water. It says, when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. So that very evening, the disciples found themselves in the middle of the Sea of Galilee facing a windstorm. And though Jesus did not depart the shore in the boat, of course, he went out to his disciples walking on the water. I mean, an incredible miracle, right? But I would say in the awe of that display of authority, that power that Jesus gives, we must make sure that we don't miss Jesus' words and the disciples' response. So when Jesus arrived to them, he said, "It is I. It is I." Another way to translate that statement is, I am. I am. I think we are supposed to hear Jesus' words in that way. I think we're supposed to go back to the story of Moses at the burning bush that Dusty read for us, right? Where God spoke to Moses and said to him, "I am who I am." In other words, God says, the only way to describe myself is by comparing me to me. I am who I am. Not I am like, I am similar to, I'm comparable with. I am who I am. In God's description of himself to Moses in that way, there is a call to receive him as he is. Not to make God who we want him to be, but to receive him according to who he is, because he is who he is. And I believe Jesus, I think he's saying the same thing to the disciples as he stands on the water. Like, it is I am. Receive me as I am. And I think the disciples heard Jesus' statement in that way. And And this time they responded by gladly taking him into the boat. They gladly received him as he was, right? Rather than a misguided response, this time they displayed trust in Jesus and they received him. And you think about this scene, in the midst of it, there was plenty that the disciples could have feared and did fear. It says they were frightened. I mean, they could have feared the wind from the storm, tossing the boat around in the middle of the sea. They could have feared the person abnormally walking out to them on the water. I mean, they could have feared the uncertainty of inviting someone into the boat who is who he is, which means they can't control him. Right? They're just receiving him as he is. But Jesus assured them, don't have to be afraid. It is I am, but don't be afraid. And when they received Jesus into the boat, they found that to be true. They didn't have to fear. The boat was even immediately at the destination. I really wish John would have written more about that. But they didn't have to fear. Jesus came into the boat, and immediately they were where they were going. What we see in all of this together is that Jesus is the great I am. He's everything that comes with that description of God about himself. And so the question then is, if Jesus is who he is, will we receive Jesus as he is? What does it look like for me? What does it look like for you in our daily lives to receive Jesus as he is? I think that's a good question to ponder this week, in the weeks to come as we continue through John's gospel. There's more that's going to be revealed to us about who Jesus is. And I think the more Jesus reveals himself, the more clarity we find about what it means to receive Jesus as he is. These scenes today very much set the stage for what is yet to come. So next week we're going to get to the rest of John 6, and the crowd that ate the miraculously provided food is going to show up again, and Jesus is going to teach them about the bread of life. And then we've got this reference from Jesus about being the I am. That's going to be uncovered through 7 specific statements, I am statements, that Jesus is going to make now in John's gospel. The first one will be next week. I am the bread of life. So this is revealing who Jesus is, but it's also setting us up for so much that is yet to come, yet to be revealed about who Jesus is. There's a lot yet coming in John's gospel, but the call has already been made. The call has already gone out. Will we receive Jesus as he is? That's really the question for us. Let's stand together. Let's come to God in prayer. Continue to ponder that statement. And I think we ought to pray that God would give us the faith, that he would deepen our trust in him to receive him as he is, because I don't think that comes naturally to us in our flesh. So let's come to God and request that from him. Father, we are here before you this morning. We see yet again who Jesus is through what is revealed in the Gospel of John. I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful for the signs that you performed that reveal your identity, the words that you speak, the teaching that you give, the way you interact with people. God, in all of this, may we be discovering that Jesus is who he is, that he is the great I am. And then in response to that, God, help us to receive you in that way. I know for me it can be very tempting to make you into who I want you to be. But I can't do that, and I shouldn't even try. You are who you are. Would you help me and help all of us to receive you that way? There's a great amount of trust involved in that. And so, God, would you help me, would you help us in that to have that increasing trust? To welcome you, gladly receive you into the boat, not fully knowing what's going to happen, but trusting in you that whatever happens, it is according to your purposes. It is for your glory. It is for ultimate good. God, give us that faith. Help us to grow into that faith. We know that's a lifetime endeavor. Would you be leading us in that way? God, we praise you further now for who you are, the things that you've revealed to us about yourselves. We want you to be glorified, God. We pray that you would be as we close our service now, singing your praises once again. We pray all this in your name. Amen.